Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Kate Milfalcher, you're very welcome to our lecture here tonight. Ken Harrington is my name, and as the night goes on, we have a little surprise in store for you toward the end of the lecture. For any of you that want to stay, any of you that have the time to stick around. In the meantime, phones please on silent. Take notice of the exits in the case of emergency. Straight out through the door you entered and away to the left, or alternatively away to my right hand side, or follow Anne. That's what we call that. Do what Anne tells me. If you hold on to questions that you have, and I'm sure you have many on this subject here at the Round Towers of Ireland tonight, just try and hold on to them, remember them, jot them down until the end of the lecture. There's a small donation box in the back of the hall. As you know, there's no membership fee for anybody who's a member of the society. You're all honorary members, more or less. Without further ado, I'm going to get cracking on because we want to introduce John to you tonight on this magnificent subject here, the Round Towers of Ireland, some of which are quite close to us. And without further ado, I'll introduce John Dolan, who you all know, a very, very great friend.
Thanks very much, and I'm amazed so many of you declined the invitation to mow the lawn or repot plants or normal things that should be going on this time of the year. So thanks again for coming along. Tonight's subject is one that I've often wondered about as you wander around Ireland and you see them. The first question that always came to my mind: where did the idea come from to build a huge tube next door to a church and put the door about 10 or 12 or 14 feet off the ground? I mean, what genius invented that? And quite honestly, there's been very little research done about where the idea came from. And the closest people I've got have been two towers in the city of Ravenna in northern Italy that initially were two standalone towers, but over time churches were built into the towers, and two basilicas came out of those churches. So that's the closest place we can link where the idea may have come, either from pilgrims or tourists or whatever, from Italy right across to Ireland. No real clue as to where the idea came from, and the chances are we'll never find it now. At that time, across Europe, religion was a visual thing. They had fantastic buildings, fantastic rituals, full of wealth, and some of it rubbed off in Ireland, and at that period we have a unique item of Irish architecture, the Round Tower. Ireland at that stage had settled down reasonably well after the stir of the Vikings. The Vikings had been sort of sorted out at that stage. It wasn't that they were gone, the Vikings still hung around, and the traces of Vikings are still here in Ireland. But in essence, Ireland, and the church particularly, had settled well. We'd had a reputation for educating Europe with the saints who travelled. Those saints had travelled to pilgrim sites like Rome and Jerusalem and had come back and talked about it and wrote about it. And the Irish church had developed in a very unique way that was totally different from the European way. The European way that eventually became the Roman way once Constantinople was left to the Muslim armies of the time. The Continental System was based around the concept of a city, and a bishop was in charge of the city, and he had these dioceses based in the city. We had a few cities, but the main focus in Ireland were the monasteries. And the monasteries themselves have become extremely rich, extremely powerful, and extremely warlike. And we'll get to some of that a little later on. So these monasteries were small towns. They had fantastic industry going on. They had carpenters, they had stonemasons, they had farmers, obviously, but they had a range of specialist skills in different locations. And as more and more of them may be excavated over time, we see that evidence for these industries coming through. They were seriously wealthy at the time. All right, I've gone through most of that. Irish churches in the early days were all wooden. When we talk about St. Patrick and Columba and the rest of them, all of those early church sites were wooden sites. And it took up to maybe the 8th century before the first stone buildings were built as churches. And they were like shoeboxes with a roof. They were a rectangular building with a door and a window and a roof, and that was it. Not used very often, and the ritual in the Irish church wasn't like the ritual today. It wasn't based on a week, Monday to Sunday. It was based on feast days, depending on whose feast day they went to the church. Other than that, well, we might go to your church occasionally, and not very often. So there were small churches built east to west, as the tradition is, the rising sun for the resurrection, and the setting sun for death. But they started to accumulate land, and with land came cattle. And cattle were always the measure of richness in the Irish society. The more cattle you had, the richer you were. Didn't matter whether you were a prince or a king or an abbot in a monastery. And it was to these older, earlier churches that the round towers got built. You're not meant to read these, okay? But we have 4 books going back to the 1800s that describe round towers. And I want to go through some of the elements of these, so I'm just showing the pictures of them. The other thing that's in these are drawings of the round towers as they were then. A lot of them have disappeared since. A lot of them have changed since. And we'll come to some of that as we get through. The first one was Margaret Stubbs, about 500 pages in this book. But Margaret had lots of drawings in her book. But to publish them, she used wood cuttings. They didn't have stencils as they would have in other books. She used wood cuttings. In other words, there was a drawing of a round tower cut into a piece of wood, and they used the imprint of the piece of wood on the paperwork when they produced Margaret's book. Marcus Keane, another large book with lots of different pictures of round towers, and as I said, we'll show you a lot of these as we get through the presentation. Henry O'Brien, another one, 1898. And the major academic one was George Petrie. I'm sure you've all heard of the antiquarian George Petrie. And George's book is again full of illustrations. So we'll get into some of those. This is George's table of contents. And look what part 1 says. Where did these round towers come from? The theory of the Danish origin of the towers. In other words, the Vikings brought the towers to Ireland. The theories of the Phoenicians or eastern origin of the round towers. And there have been some suggestions that said that maybe round towers came across to Ireland from the minarets of the Muslim mosques. All right, there we are. Theories of the pagan uses of round towers. We'll have a look at some of these. And the theories of the Christian origin and uses of the round towers. So this is how Petrie starts off his book. Now he evolves his theories right through to the remainder of the book. But that's what people in the late 1800s were thinking round towers may have come from. As for Henry O'Brien, he was very convinced it was the Tuatha De Danann who brought the round towers to Ireland. From his point of view, the Tuatha De Danann had come from northern Spain, from Galicia, so therefore it was really a Spanish import. He was right about it being an import. The country was wrong. A tourist wandering around Ireland in the 1700s said, in the churchyard stands an old steeple, a little detached from the church, which some of us think was the work of Ostmen of Cork. Now, Ostmen was another name used for the Vikings. In Keane's book, the Phoenicians erected them, the Christians built them for bell towers, the magicians used them for astronomical purposes. I'm not sure what he meant by magicians, by the way. That they were for Christian anchorites to shut up themselves up in. In other words, if you wanted to be a hermit in the monastery of the early church, you built yourself a round tower, you went up there and you threw the key out the window. They were used for penitentiaries. Well, yeah, you wonder. That the Druids used them to proclaim their festivals, and that Christians used them to keep their church plate and treasures. Lots of interesting ideas as to where they came from. So, fire temples, sundials, astronomical observatories, Buddhist temples. I'm not sure where the Buddhists appeared from this one. Phallic fertility symbols, penitential prisons, hermitage, and you can read the list yourselves. But really, round towers were really the Celtic tiger of the day. What it said was, my church is wealthy, my church is able to hire in specialists who can chisel stone and create a building that everybody will see from miles around. And this will show how important I am, and everybody will say, gosh, that church is important. So it really was for show. The name of the church in Gaelic gave the purpose of it away. Cloigtheach, in other words, the house for bells, a belfry. And that was there always in the books. So even though I talked about the antiquarian books in the earlier slides, we all knew that from ancient times, in the annals, written at the time, they were called Cloigtheachs. So they were known as belfries at the time. And the bells were used to summon the monks from the fields and let them know when they should come back to the monastery and say their prayers. Or if there were special things going on at the time, like the harvest, they collected together in the field and prayed together in the field when the bell tolls. And St. Benedict in his rule was fairly rough on any monk who didn't obey the bell. You went into a penitential process immediately if you didn't obey the bell at the time. Were they repositories? And the answers are they were. Books, bells and croziers were kept in some of them at the time. Were they used for display at the time of pilgrimage? And there is a story that in some of them, the bishop used to ascend the ladder to the door of the church and hold up the monstrance for the crowds who come on pilgrimage or the annual patron day that every church would have had. Were they used for security? We'll see later, but they weren't particularly secure, particularly from fire. Were they used for grain storage? And the answer is probably not, because they wouldn't have been sealed sufficiently to keep vermin out. And lastly, were they used as lookouts? Probably. But there's no evidence of that just yet. But the strange thing about it is is, even though they're called Cloigtheach, we have never found bells at any church site in any part of Ireland, ever. We have found bells that subsequently went back to a church because the reputation was it was a particular saint's bell, but we've never actually found bells on church sites in Ireland up to now. Some of them had well-lit floors. In other words, there's enough windows so you could see where you were going. In most of them, the architecture got it right. In other words, it was a tapering tube that tapered correctly and with a cone top to keep the rain out. The other interesting site, and I'll show issue there of where it was sited, and I'll show you a few slides on that, is that in general, if you came out of the door of the church, the round tower was positioned on your right hand side, just a couple of 100 yards away, and the door of the round tower was looking at the door of the church. That is a regular pattern. So it appears that there was some ritual or linkage involved between that. Maybe it was processional, maybe it was for displaying a relic or demonstrance or whatever. But that is a fact in an awful lot of cases. As we'll see later, not too many other places copy this. You can't go to Europe as you can today and see churches and monasteries that the Irish saints built. You can't see round towers included in those. So the idea didn't really flow back to Europe. The archaeological inventory says there's 86 in the country. When you drive around, you find 65. Most were built, the earliest one in Slane, 950, up to Annadown in County Louth, sorry, it's in County Galway, it's beside the Corrup, 1238. So the building of them wasn't over a very long period, and on average 5 to 7 stories high. Because of that, the height could be up to 30 metres, but the majority are just over 10 metres. And no two towers are exactly the same. So they're all built uniquely by the local monastery with money from the local patron of the monastery or the local king. This is Glendalough. You all know Glendalough. Glendalough, as you know, has 2 round towers. And you can see the cathedral, as it's called, and where it's positioned at the round tower. The door of the round tower is looking at the door of the cathedral. The second is St. Kevin's, yeah. This is the second round tower. It's a much smaller round tower. You've all been to Glendalough, I'm sure. Now, the original church, if you go into the cathedral, as it's called in Glendalough, and just walk around it, you will see that square rectangular bit. And at the top, you'll see where it was extended in good old Irish building style, and not too well. But you can see where at one stage it was a certain size, and then the builders came in and did a bit more. This is the classic old monastic site with the fences around it, and here there's 2 circles. Today, that's the one you walk through when you walk in. The hotel is just across from the stream. The round tower is here, and the annual archaeological dig by UCD is in this field at the back of the cemetery. And to be there again this year, for those of you who've been interested enough to go along in earlier years. Kildare, and again the round tower is opposite the main entrance. And the same for Clonmacnoise. Here's the doorway, the round tower, and the 2 doors are looking at one another. And there's other examples. Right, that's where they are on the map. Northern Ireland is not included because the archaeological surveys of Northern Ireland is managed by a government department called PRONI. Now, they do lots of other things other than manage the archaeological database. But PRONI have their own version of the Irish archaeological database. And if you want to go onto it, it's an excellent website. It's one I use an awful lot myself. That's the web address of it, archaeology.ie. It's a simple web address to remember. The most recent map done is Lawler's one of 1997. And it's almost the same. What you do notice is there's very few in the northwest. Donegal. Mayo is running light. Galway, west of the Corrup, is running light. And Kerry and Cork, what happened to them?
Waterford, is anything in Waterford?
Oh yeah, there's a couple in Waterford. Ardmore is the major one.
Yeah, I guess it's very light there.
Yeah. Oh no, I did a survey of the holy wells in Waterford, and I think there's 11. Now that's where you'd expect to see the round towers. Dublin, 5 in the archaeological record. Some of them are still signs there, others are gone. St. Michael le Pole, you all know where that was. Between Christchurch and St. Patrick's. And some of that, what would you call lawn, beside St. Patrick's Cathedral. That's where it's at. And actually, I'm not sure if I put in the picture of it, maybe I did later on, but we'll see it. It had quite a small church and quite a small round tower.
But that's gone completely now.
Oh yeah, no, it wiped out, if you want to face it like that. So there's 2 types, really. There's the type that stick out on their own, stick out on their own, and there's the type that are attached to other things. And I'm using the 2 in Clonmacnoise there. The one that's on its own, it's obvious. The one in St. Kevin's. Now, the engaged ones are either built in or stuck onto the round tower. And I'm going to show you a few examples of that. The top one on the left is that one in Tallaght. And here you can see the church with its entrance, and then back here was the round tower. And the question you ask is, was the tower there first and they surrounded it? Or when they were building the church, did they build the tower simultaneously? I just don't know. The bottom one down here is the small one in Cloigtheach. Maybe I didn't show it to you when I was showing you the map of Cloigtheach. There's a second one in Cloigtheach, Cloigtheach. That's it here. And again, you can see the round tower and the church is built around it. The bottom right is Cormac's castle in Cashel. And again, the round tower was there first, and then gradually both a church, which was followed by a cathedral, were built around it. So it's hard to actually see it when you go down there. And then the one at the top right is Kilkenny. So there are examples of both. They still survive today. And here's one where it started off as a round tower with a church beside it. The Normans came along and they built a keep at the end of the church and 3 extra towers and turned it into a very fancy looking church with a round tower. Well, actually there's 4 towers, one of them with no hat. Mention the bells. They're never mentioned anywhere in the archive. It was meant for bells, no mention of bells and no use of bells. So we've no idea the size or shape. Margaret Stokes, in one of the early books we talked about, went up the tower at Glendalough with a large handbell and rang it. And she had fellas going up and down the valley in Glendalough to see how far they could go to hear the bell. And on average, the sound that the handbells that she used travelled up to 2 miles. So if a monk was working in the fields up to 2 miles from the round tower in Glendalough, they could hear her bell ringing. So it proved...
How big did the handguns then be? You must be very big in order to make that noise.
Well, I've been in schoolyards where the principal comes out with the bell, and by God, you heard the bell.
Yeah.
And I normally didn't want to stand beside it. Some of them might have been up to 1 foot high, the handbells. Others were much higher, and another slide on that. Interestingly enough, in the Brehon law, which, as you know, the later part of the Brehon law is very modelled on church law, and you were a person of status. So the bell ringer in the church environment was of use. Now the other thing they wondered about bells was, did they use them for cattle? And the chances are that they did, in the same way that people in Switzerland still use today. Here are 3 European examples of bells being rung. In each case, the bells are hanging there and somebody comes along and gives them a belt with a hammer. Now, I wouldn't regard that as a job for life myself. I prefer to be downstairs with a long rope and the bells way up high in the top of the round tower rather than doing this. But these are 3 examples of how it was possible that the bells might have been heard. Gortnahow is one of the major places, and it's not the only one, where we found extensive bell production. So they made it from iron and then coated it with copper alloy. The small ones, you can see the height there. The large ones were quite big. And some of them, as we know, were put into enclosures and used for relics of the saint belonging to the church. And in the bottom one there, the Bardon Ciaran was a bell from a parish in the Midlands, where it was regarded as a major relic in the Midlands. And it was brought whenever treaties need to be signed off, so that the king swore on the bell that he would keep the treaty and not break it. And if he did break it, the bell was rung and a curse was put on. There were significant items. three drawings from Margaret Stokes' book. I talked about the book earlier. The Bell of St. Patrick. Can't read that one. Cloigtheach. And the last one is just examples of bells. But you can see how there were rough items. There was no elegancy in them. There was nothing like the bells that we see today. And they might have done the job, but we don't know. Let's have a chat about building round towers and what we can see from them. As I say, the majority were built over a 200-year period. The earliest, as I said, was the one in Slane, and that's recorded in the Annals of the Four Masters, the Annals of Ulster, and the Codex Scotorum. Now, funny enough, none of them agree in the year. They all have a different year for as to when Slane was built. But it gives you an indication. They never talk about the starting date, so we've no idea how long it took to build them. They only said the bell tower in such and such a place was completed. But they can be dated by the construction of the doorways, and I will come to that later. And whereas towers in square towers mainly in Europe all had stairs going up them, the Irish bell towers had ladders, and only ladders. Clondalkin, as you know, have steps going up to the doorway from the ground, but that was added much, much later. That wasn't put there at the time that the Clondalkin's round tower was built. We all know about the roof. We were very good at building a roof that narrowed at the centre through the corbel technology that the guys who built Newgrange knew about, whatever it is, 5,000 years ago. So most of them had a corbelled roof. Today, nearly all of them have lost their roofs. This is the base of a tower, again from the Midlands. Now, what you can see here is masonry that has been touched up. And one of the things we've spotted in recent times is that in the time of the antiquarians, where they found loose stones hanging around round towers, Jimmy was sent up with a ladder and a bucket of cement and told, stick that stone back in again. So you can see lots of places where it's been nicely finished, but we wonder how much of it is really the original mortar that was used to put the stones together. The other thing is, that was never the doorway. So that's only recent, maybe in the last 200 years. But from the interior of it, you can see it's quite small. Now, Circularn would be certainly one of the earlier round towers built in Ireland, so it would have been in the 900-year period, all right. The other thing is that this looked a bit like the Celtic tower we're building. This is Cashel. I'm not too sure what tells that me about the setting blocks on top of one another. I'm not sure I'd like a house built like that. And this one over here, whereas down here we have other examples where the stonework appears to be excellent. So your stonemason skills was different around the country. And this one of Cashel is still standing. Okay, it's propped up by other buildings that have been built around it recently. And the major issue for most of these guys was building an arch. They needed an arch for the windows and they needed an arch for the doorways. Now the Romans have been introducing arches all around Europe for hundreds of years before the arrival of Christ, and arches got to Britain, but arches never got to Ireland. And most people said, well, putting an arch in, that's only decorative. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. If you want a doorway, you build your walls, you put a lintel across the top, and that's all you need. But as we see, the styles did change over time, and builders had to learn by trial and error. And it really didn't get to a standard, a good standard, until the arrival of the Cistercians and the Normans. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. This looks like an arch, but it isn't. It's just one lump where they carved out around the middle. Same happened here, same happened there. This one is an extremely rough looking of an arch. And this one has a long one and multiple short ones. And this one has a sort of lintel sitting over the arch, just in case the arch wasn't able to hold up the rest of the tower. So you can learn a number of things just by looking at how they were constructed. And it took them a long time to work it out. Interesting statistic there. There's no doors on 22 of the towers today. Does that mean that originally there was a door and over time somebody filled it in? We come to our doorways, and again, as I said, most of them are just straightforward lintels. And again, these are from the old books that I talked about, books produced over 200 years ago. And as you can see, the bottom right-hand one is a very different door from the other ones. And they were working their way through variations of these doorways and lintels until they got to an arched doorway, which they did eventually. Two more. Another one. Now, interesting enough, this one from Roscrea, this is a drawing done in the 1880s. On the inside, we find hinges inside the doorway. So they actually had a wooden door, a physical door, inside the doorway. And maybe the round towers were always locked up, but the only evidence we have is from this one in Roscrea. That's what it looks like from the front. Three more examples. Windows were the same. As you can see, the one on the right here are two slabs put sort of joining one another. Same issue with the doorway. Something simple that will work. Forget about the arch. Many towers had 4 windows. Kildare and Kells had 5. Clonmacnoise and Tullahat had 8. Now we know for sure that the Clonmacnoise one started off at 4 windows, and that over time they added 4 more, all at different periods. So there was major renovation done on a number of the towers, and we know of instances where a lot of that happened in the 1880s. Windows again, different types. And the bottom one here, on the right hand side with the red explanation mark, is Kells, which has 3 different window types in the one tower. So whether they're all built together at the same time with 3 different stonemasons who had 3 different ideas as to how to put in windows. It must have been interesting times being a builder in those days. We have word from the annals about certain round towers. We go to the site today and there's no sign of the round tower. For sure, if the archaeologists did a geophys examination of the area around it, they'd find it. And I've often wondered about that in Tallaght. Did Tallaght have a round tower? Now, Tallaght would have been of the age and the time where you'd expect as a major church, monastery at the time, it would have had a round tower. But there's no evidence today, and today there isn't much land to go and do a geophys on, because most of it has been used for other things. And maybe some of the builders in recent years who were told to go and develop that field or whatever came across stuff and the JCB just ran over it, because that happened a lot in our Ireland. So we know it from the annals and the manuscripts, we know it from drawings. Why are they gone? Well, we'll go through some of the examples of what happened to other round towers that we do know of. Most references are not positive, they're negative. Only 2 refer to construction, and I give you the quotes there from Clonmacnoise and Anadan. The finishing of the Cloigtheach of Clonmacnoise by Ua Mueloin, successor of Ciarán, and the Cloigtheach of Anadan was erected in 1238, according to the Annals of the Four Masters. Now, we get into why some of them may have gone. The belfry of Slane was burned by the farmers. Well, you don't have to think too hard as to who they were. With it full of relics and distinguished persons, together with Cian Ocker, rector of Slane and the crozier of the patron saint. So the tower was full of people and relics, and the Vikings came along and burned it. Also in 995, Ardmachar was burned by lightning. Both houses, Davlin is the old Irish name for a church, and Cloigtheach and Finnid, a complete destruction such as occurred not an era before. Downpatrick was totally burned with its church and Cloigtheach by lightning. The Cloigtheach of Clun fell. Okay, and the one in Roscommon was burned by the men of Breffni. There was still lots of cattle raiding going on, and the most infamous one is the monks from Clonmacnoise raiding the monastery at Durrow with their aim of collecting 600 cattle and bring them back to Clonmacnoise. And hundreds of monks on both sides were slaughtered. So, whatever about the island of saints and scholars, there was lots of war going on. Murchad, son of Flann, at the expiration of 3 days and 3 nights after he had assumed the supremacy of Chower, was treacherously killed in the Cloigtheach of Camps by the Lord of Gaelanga. So even though he got the big job, the knives came out fairly fast and he only lasted 3 days. And then a great hosting by Conor MacPhail. That phrase, a great hosting, means a war group. Together with the people of the north of Ireland came to Meath and the burnt Trim, both the belfry and the church, and these were full of people. So Ireland was not at peace. The chief master was burned in the Cloigtheach of Ferta. The Cloigtheach was burnt by Kieran with it full of people in it, and Donald was burnt by his kinsmen in Devonish. Peaceful times, how are you? The weather had a factor. This Cloigtheach, whose name in Austria I won't attempt to pronounce, was split by a thunderbolt, and a stone flew from the Cloigtheach and killed a student in the church. A very destructive wind in this year, about the feast of Bridget. When you saw some of the examples of building around Tower earlier, it blew down the bell tower and caused much danger. There were such boisterous stormy winds this year that fell down many turrets, and among the rest of it fell down violently the steeple in Loud and other steeples. So, lots of reasons. We did sort of say at the beginning that there wasn't very many round towers built outside of Ireland. Where there were really were in the remote areas in Scotland and on the Isle of Man. And there aren't too many at all. There's only a handful of them. Brecon in Angus in Scotland and Abernethy in Perthshire. Now the interesting thing about the one in Brecon is the doorway. I put a little picture, a very elaborate doorway, and my guess is that's a later addition. In other words, the door was first built and then somebody came along later and enhanced it by putting lots of pretty things around the doorway. Peel in the Isle of Man, an unusual looking round tower. The Orkney Islands and the island of Oran. And also more in the Orkneys themselves. So again, the relationship between the Irish Church, particularly the Church in Northern Ireland, and the Scottish Church was very strong. And in this case, the idea of the round tower travelled. So why did they only last 200 years? What happened? That suddenly they stopped building round towers. And once again, we blame the immigrants. What had been happening in Europe was major church reform. And funny enough, at the same time, there was lots of bishops writing to the bishops and the kings in Ireland saying, the Irish church has to reform. But it wasn't reforming. The reforms in Europe were mainly spurred by Pope Gregory. And then St. Bernard and St. Augustine came along. And from them we had the first monastic rules. And religious orders who followed those rules. And there was lots of them. But along with that, Reformation was cultural reform. And the way the cultural reform was shown from a monastic point of view were a range of new church buildings. The idea of basilicas came from that reform. The idea of building a crypt underneath a church came from that reform. And some of the ways that the new churches were being built, galleries and vaulting, I'll show you in the next few slides. But you can see where the Irish church had been with its shoebox church. Just a shoebox with a door and a roof. And the ones that have survived a lot are the ones with stone roofs. The ones who had thatched roofs generally have not survived. Thatched or wooden. So St. Malachy went to Rome, and on his way back met St. Bernard in the centre of France. And the two of them got on like a house on fire. And Malachy was looking at the monks who had come to follow Bernard and said, gosh, you guys are doing very well. I wish you lot were over back in Ireland with me, because you have a fantastic view of what way the church should be moving and the discipline introduced by following a monastic rule. In Ireland, we had very few bishops. Each monastery had its own rules or no rules at all. Each bishop in the year 680 was told, from now on you can only have one wife. Right up to the 1200s, Irish monks usually had at least one wife. So we were a different type of church every which way. The Continental monks arrived, and they were the immigrants. And where were they given first? Mellifont. The Irish monks were stunned. What are these lot? These are not Christians at all. These are a different animal. And not only the discipline of how they worked, but particularly, and again it started in Mellifont, the way they worked their lands. And the monks in Mellifont were granted a huge amount of land in the early days. They could produce far more with their discipline out of the land than any Irish monastery. So when the princes saw this, they said, well, I'll save me money and I'll build no more round towers. I'll save my money and I'll invite in the Cistercians and the Augustinians and the other orders in to my monastery, because it is my monastery. I know that fella Abbot thinks it's his monastery, but I pay the bills. And that's the revolution and the evolution of that. So Mellifont, an old photograph on the bottom left there. Look at the layout. Suddenly, you remember that shoebox I was pointing out in Kells? Suddenly we had a different animal. This was the first one in Ireland. When this was opened, the High King of Ireland, as he was called, wasn't really a High King, he just had a nice title. Lots of other kings, bishops and archbishops arrived. And they sort of said, this is a serious message which we want the rest of the church in Ireland to take over. It's not a shoebox. It's lots of connected buildings. If we go back to that old drawing we had of Tallaght and Kildare and Clonmacnoise, the position with them was you had one building for the church, and then around that you had individual cells for each monk, usually built of clay and wattle. In other words, they were almost movable houses. And they had very little items in community, the Irish monks. Whereas these guys had a refectory, and they had a reading room. If the Irish monks had any community room at all, it was their library, where they read the holy books and they wrote the holy books. So you can see the layout of Mellifont there. Now, it didn't follow a particular French pattern. These guys spoke French. These guys had to learn to talk to the locals, had to learn Irish. But there was lots of bishops going over and back, so it wasn't regarded as a problem. As I said, part of the change was to build new types of churches. And that item I talked about all through about the vaults suddenly started to appear in the roof of churches. In other words, you had a rounded roof, not the normal V-shaped roof of wood that the Irish monks had. You had a vaulted roof. And the other thing, you had galleries, 3 stories on the bottom left hand here, and 3 stories on the top right hand one there. So not only were they, because of the vault, broader, but they had multiple stories. And certainly on the second floor here, you had a pathway in behind the pillars here, where the monks used to walk along. And if you go into Christchurch today, that's the model. St. Patrick's had been started off like that, but then was changed and became Gothic architecture rather than Renaissance architecture, which this is. So it was different. Now, the monks in Glendalough, the monks in Armagh, and the monks in Cloigtheach didn't like this. And there was real rows later. It all came, the Cistercians, as we know, came from Citeaux, which is still there, bottom right hand corner, but it survived the French Revolution in a weird and wonderful way, which is 1 or 2 other lectures, I'm afraid. But I want to show you here some old photographs of ones you know very well. You can see the Glendalough one there, and the drawings of the smaller of the 2 round towers as they were in the 1800s. Not well kept, one would say. More photographs. Notice the one on the top left. What's missing? The caption. And it had gone. And I'll show you again later. But the classic one is the main picture, the main coloured picture in the middle. That's a John Hine postcard of Glendalough. Lord Dunraven took a photograph at Glendalough in 1870, and the head was gone. 20 years later, Lawrence took a photograph of the same thing, and the head was back on it. And you can go around Glendalough, particularly Glendalough, because it had become a tourist location at that stage. They built a hotel in Glendalough between the upper lake and the lower lake, which has since gone. It became a tourist place, and you can go around Glendalough and see where they've changed things. You can see the use of modern cement as against ancient mortar. There's a whole lot of indications that this place was dolled up for tourists in the 1800s. Again, interesting ones at Clondalkin, and I wish there was ones of Tallaght to show, but unfortunately we can't prove there ever was one here. Devonish, the reason I put this one up is the level of artistry that went into on some of the bands around the church. More examples. All right. Have they ever been excavated? Only 3 have, and none of them recently. And that's an extraordinary mistake. But I'll go into that. 2 of them in Antrim and Armagh, somebody went in and dug out the insides and threw the insides away without looking to see what's rent and value in them. Just emptied the insides. The small one in Clonmacnoise was excavated, what year? 1845. It had rubbish up to the door. In other words, people had come along over time and just flung stuff in, so the rubbish built up. 4 feet. And down there they found 2 skeletons and bones of all sorts, human, animal, anything. It had never been disturbed before, and once somebody had written down 1 or 2 things about it, they threw the whole lot back in again. Now in today's world you'd excavate it inch by inch, you'd record and photograph everything, and everything would be tested. The bones would be tested for type and age. The clay and material would be tested to see if it had pollen, and from the pollen they could judge what crops were being grown in that area around that time. So with today's scientific approach to excavating a place like this, you would come out with substantial reports. Really interesting stuff. This is from Clonmacnoise. So the first 1.5 foot from the sill to underside of the projection floor, dressed work. I have no idea what the hell that is. I'd love to try and find out, but I haven't a clue.
It's coursed stone.
Coarse stone.
Yeah.
I believe it. The next layer was rubble masonry, in other words, stuff people had thrown in. Then gravel sand, then yellow clay, and then gravel, sand, and boulder stones. That's what the description of the one there. Kilkenny was interesting. Most of us have been to Kilkenny City and have stood and looked at the Round Tower and walked into the cathedral. The Round Tower, when they excavated it, was built on top of a cemetery. So that when they went into the Round Tower and down to the base, they found under the base skeletons. And there's two of them, and there's one in what appears to be a coffin on the right hand side of the top. And again, no scientific research whatsoever later. We've replicated ones in different places. Daniel O'Connell's in Glasnevin is a replica Round Tower. It's not a real one. I'm not sure tourists are told one way or the other. And then there's one for the famine in Massachusetts. And there's a reasonably good website. It's not kept up to date, but it's there. roundtowers.org, that gives the list of all the counties and what round towers are in different counties. And there are 3 relatively good books. 2 of them are here in the library itself. The third one is, what's his name? Cloigtheach's one. It's probably on its way into the library here. Tighe's one is the most recent one in the round towers. Shinaway. Thank you very much.
Any questions, folks?
Yeah.
Show yourself up. On ahead, who's there?
Go ahead.
Could the thought be that the tower was like the Tower of Babel, reaching to heaven?
Yeah, I've seen drawings of the Tower of Babel, but they're ones that came out of Cúgad Gael Regalh, which is a circular spiral building going up that's round at the bottom and then spirals up almost into a point at the top. Nobody knows what the Tower of Babel looked like. I mean, there's lots of
near to God, like near.
Yeah, no, it could be well be the same idea. Yeah, the higher we go, nearer to God. Yeah, could be.
Who would have come to Ireland first, the Normans or Saint Malachy coming back from the continent?
Malachy was here earlier than the Normans. Most of these round towers were built before the Norman arrival, so it wasn't a Norman influence. What the Normans brought were the curved doorway and windows, and then the revolution came with the monastic monasteries, monks from Europe. Some of the monastic monks had taken over church sites in England and then moved to Ireland, but the majority of them came from France. That revolution, architectural revolution, started in France, went to England, and gradually bits went down into Spain and Italy.
Well, we didn't have roads and obviously road signs or anything like that. Were they just a landmark so that people could find the monastery?
Well, they may have been. There were roads in Ireland, all right, but not what we normally would call roads. Don't forget, in the society that was in Ireland right up to this period, each area was its own tua. If you were born into a tua, unless you were of the royal family, you couldn't leave the tua. So even if you were born in Armagh, you couldn't go on pilgrimage to Glendalough if you were a commoner. You could if you were a member of the royalty or if you were a senior cleric. So moving out of a tua was almost impossible. That part of the Breton law stayed right through, certainly until the arrival of the Normans. And even after that, you were almost a slave born into your tua at that stage.
So it was like the serfs then?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, you were owned by the master.
Yeah, in feudal England and France.
And if you fell foul of the law at that time, it was generally the women who suffered. The cummel, as they were called. Kesh? No.
John, in Tallaght, we knew where the church the main church building, we say like in Glendalough, was centred in the village. Therefore, as you come out from the door of that building, it'd be a matter of
Yes.
making a
direction would be
calculation
there.
to your right.
If you can work out the doorway for the first church or early church, you can then almost guarantee the position of the round tower if it was built. And if there was still grass on the ground, you could go at it through geophys and see if the foundation of... They weren't very deep. The foundations of these things were not at all deep. So it's no wonder a lot of them fell apart or were held when they were burnt.
And were they all built from the stone from the area? Or?
There would have been. There wouldn't have been too much horses and carts dragging granite around the place. It would have been local stone. No problem for Tallaght.
You mentioned earlier about the round tower of St. Michael de Paul between St. Patrick's Cathedral and Christ Church. But that round tower wouldn't have been built until the 13th century?
Oh no, it was earlier than that, I would have said. And it was one of these engaged round towers. In other words, the small church and the small tower were joined onto one another. No.
So the two cathedrals came after that?
Oh, they did. Yeah. I mean, there was a church on Christchurch site going well back. When the Vikings lost their power, at that time we have evidence of a church site on Christchurch site. But it was a different shape, different size, different material.
It wasn't a cathedral at that time?
No, not at all.
John, do you disagree with the repointing of some of this stuff?
Well, it's understandable. I mean,
disagree?
it wouldn't be done today.
Yeah.
It couldn't be.
No, the way I answer that, the one in Comic Niles, the one with the top on it, the cone, and the other one is in a terrible state.
Yeah.
You know, you would think they'd have a guard to even keep you away.
Yeah.
And I often wonder why they didn't redo it.
They'll only touch them today for safety reasons.
Yeah.
You know, they won't touch them ever again.
But it looks odd, you know, one they're good and the other one it's the top.
It looks a bit banjaxed.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a technical term, is it?
So you're going back to the bell towers. For the person at the top of the tower ringing the bell, he must have been deaf.
Well, not only that, but he's fairly
He'd be
fit.
deaf very quickly.
He was fairly fit. He had to get up those ladders.
No, but the mere fact of ringing a bell
yeah.
of the size that you're mentioning,
Yeah. Well,
in such a confined space.
yeah, that's a hand swung bell.
Oh,
My guess is they were fixed, like those drawings, they were fixed and he came up with a hammer and belted them with the hammer.
Yeah, but for the person inside a little narrow tube like it,
Yeah, the days
it
of
must
having
be
earplugs.
incredibly bad.
The days of having earplugs hadn't been invented yet.
Yeah.
Or cotton wool.
Or cotton wool. Well, they would have had lots of sheep wool they could have stuffed their ears with.
More health and safety out.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned about the tests carried out in Glendalough and the sound carried for 2 miles.
Now, this is 1840s when Margaret Stokes did this.
Right, okay. But I would have thought that if you weren't ringing the bell at a window, that the sound wouldn't have travelled very far at all. And then it would, if you were doing it at a window, most of the sound would actually travel in the direction of where the window was, and not in 360 degrees.
There's no record in her book of how she carried out the test. In other words, was it wrong in the centre of the round tower, and people outside, the sound would have been in that confined space and come out the 4 windows. One thing I forgot to say about the windows, they all pointed in the cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, right? So that they would cover all directions. But you're right, they could have hung his arm out and belted away good up and hoped the monks up this side heard it as well as the monks over this side.
They could have taken total rung through each direction of the window.
They could have done.
Go around each window.
And maybe that was part of the construction in that ascending order, north, south, east and west.
Well, where there are 4 windows at the top, they're all built north, south, east and west. But I wouldn't regard it as a fantastic career in a bell ringer.
The round tower in Waterford City, that was built at the beginning, I think, of the 10th century.
Yeah.
That would be one of the earliest round towers then.
It would have been. Was that not built by the Vikings or with Viking money? I think the Vikings sponsored that one.
Yeah.
In Waterford. No, I've never looked at it, so I can't say. Kerstella? Well, thank you very much. Come on,
Thank you very much, John. Really Jack. I've visited so many places that.
Did you believe in it?
What?
Did you
A
believe in
little
it?
bit of it. We used to, with the kids, bring the kids to Glendalough, we used to tell them it was a mobile phone mast. I got the message. Do you know what I mean? That's effectively what
Sorry,
Glendalough was,
ringing there.
calling everybody more for your breakfast, your dinner, or tea. Very, very recently, the Tallaght Historical Society adopted a flag, a unity flag of Tallaght. That flag will be here present for our next lecture. So on that occasion, the flag will be physically present. Tonight, what we're going to show to you and exhibit to you is a banner, which is kind of like, which is just the forerunner of the flag that's going to be presented here on our next lecture. So we also have the chap behind the idea for the flag. It's the Tallaght flag of unity. We think it's high time the Tallaght had a flag of its own, flown over the village and over the town and over eventually the city of Tallaght when the municipal when that actually takes place. So without further ado, this is you all know Anne Hanlon, of course, our chairperson, and this is Joe. And Joe Woody here is the man behind the design, and I think you'll be impressed. And if you have any questions, encashed whatsoever at all, Joe's the man to. If you're looking for some small explanation, Joe here, of course, is the main guy. We have 3 8-pointed stars here, blue in colour. The 8-pointed star is an ancient symbol of Ireland, an ancient Celtic symbol, the sunburst. These 3 8-pointed stars represent the past, the present and the future. As regards the red deer here, well, the red deer is our native red deer. The antlers of the red deer are reaching out to members of all communities, of all ethnicities, of all religions and of no religion that live within the Tallaght and the greater Tallaght area, which is a massive area with a population of about 130,000. So it's reaching out and grabbing to everybody. Also, it has a great significance going back to Glenasmole, Usheen, Fionn Agus na Fianna. And actually, if you want to go on about any more of that, Joe, you're much more familiar with the Glenasmole angle on this.
Yeah, possibly. There's the the Deer Park area as well, which is well known up until a number of years ago. It would have been fairly well known up towards Old Bawn and beyond that area. The story of Usheen being one of Fionn, who went hunting in Glenasmole alone and encountered a young lady who transformed herself the next morning into a deer. He never saw her again. Very sad for Fionn. He consoled himself, I think, with many other wives throughout the course of his life. But some months later, travelling again with a band of his Fianna through Glenasmole, he encountered a young fair-haired boy beneath an oak tree. And this son, he assumed, could only be his own. And he adopted him as his son and called him Usheen, meaning little deer. So again, we have some kind of connection to our mythology represented in this. The green could be seen in a number of fashions, but I think the natural hinterland and the ecology of the area is reflected there. For me,
If anybody wants photograph or anything,
Sorry.
There'll be no writing on the flag. I mean, a flag wouldn't have any writing. This is just, as you can see, Tallaght the Céile. But the flag will basically be this: your standard size GPO national type flag size, without the writing on same. So I think Joe and Anne and the committee are to be congratulated on their adoption of this flag. This is a project. How long was this going, Joe?
I think the first efforts to put it on the cloth was in 2007 with Tallaght Youth Theatre. It's been on the cloth in various forms with Tallaght Community Arts since 2010, I'd imagine, and 2013. It was in Tallafest 2013 in various forms on a stall being displayed. But this new version, this latest rendition, hopefully the final rendition, it's me walking away from it and giving it to you guys, and hopefully it being taken up by more people in the area, and hopefully will become a symbol of what we can become going forward.
So put the word out there, folks. I hope you like the flag. Any thoughts on it all? If you want to approach any members of the committee, or Joe here will be around for a few minutes, you can ring the confidential line. Try and keep that line open until about 12 midnight. And if you have any problems, want to talk about flags, Joe's the man. So good meal, all good. Safe home, everybody. Switch back on your phones. And thanks again to John Dolan.